Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the headquarters of the National Association of Manufacturers. I'm Jay Timmons. I'm the president and CEO here. And for those of you who are not familiar with the NAM, we represent manufacturers of all sizes and all sectors, from the world's largest multinationals to small and medium-sized manufacturers all up and down main streets all across America. And we're the voice for 12 million men and women who make things in the United States. So today is day 2 of Infrastructure Week. It started off very strongly yesterday with a full day's worth of programs, and our guest speaker was a speaker at an event I was at last night. So he's been very involved with Infrastructure Week. We've seen representatives from the business community, from organized labor, think tanks, and others in this very collaborative effort to demonstrate the urgency of infrastructure improvements and how that urgency is really uniting diverse interests. So for manufacturers, infrastructure is really a competitiveness issue. It matters in every step of the production process, from receiving inputs to shipping our products to our customers, not only here, but also to markets overseas. We're also vital suppliers to the transit and construction industries. In other words, investments in infrastructure have a multiplier effect across our entire economy. But despite the proven benefits of infrastructure improvements, efforts to improve our nation's infrastructure continue to meet with roadblocks, particularly from the regulatory and permitting framework. And that's the topic of the conversation here today. So to launch this discussion, we're very honored to have with us a leader who has grappled with these issues in both the public and the private sectors. He's made regulatory reform a priority from his current vantage point in the United States Senate. As governor of Maine and in the private sector, Angus King has developed alternative energy and conservation projects. And today, he is Maine's first independent United States Senator. Now, I once served as a chief of staff to a governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, so I saw firsthand what governors face when they're trying to improve the infrastructure within the borders of their states. Senator King understands the challenges that are associated with infrastructure investments, and I have to say that we really couldn't have asked for a better leader to offer his insights to us here today. So, Senator King, welcome to the NAM.
Thank you. Those of you, delighted to be with you, and those of you who have encountered me before know that I never read speeches. I always just talk, but I wrote something in 1992 that I think you might enjoy. And it sort of sets the context for what we're talking about today. So bear with me for a minute. I know it's not as, it's a little boring when you're reading, but God cleared his throat nervously as he rose to address the Board of Environmental Protection. His engineers had been working on the plans for the Tides project for almost 2.5 years, and the environmental impact statement, 3 volumes not counting appendices, was complete. But he knew the board staff was hostile and that the neighbors, in this case everyone in the world who owned coastal real estate, were violently opposed. They had organized a group called CRAP, Coastal Residents Against Pollution. Audubon and the Conservation Law Foundation had intervened. Earth First, in a well-attended press conference, had announced that they were boycotting the process entirely and would sabotage the project even if it was permitted. God felt he had to go forward, however. Something had to be done with the oceans twice a day because of the gravitational effect of the moon. Having the water rise and fall along the coast seemed to be a reasonable solution. Most people now like the moon, by the way, although there had been some opposition to that project at first. The opposition had been based on the grounds of visual pollution of the night sky. You could not see the stars as well as before. Friends of the animals also objected because of the unfair advantage the moon gave to predators, like foxes and owls that were after rodents. Fortunately, friends of the predators had intervened and helped God out. Finally, God settled the moon case by promising no more than one full moon a month, and that it would be phased in at that. It had been a close call. The vote was 5-4, and the board was getting tougher all the time. God also felt some financial pressure to go ahead, although he would never mention this to the board. He'd already spent $2 million on the application, and he figured the only way of recouping any of that was to complete at least some part of the project. We are aware that there might be some unavoidable environmental effects from this project, God said, opening his prepared statement. The several hundred members of CRAP in the audience, most of whom held signs which said things like, "Tides in, God's out," and "No bathtub ring for our world," laughed derisively. Some hissed. Their attorney rolled his eyes, but God continued. Some such effect is inevitable if we're to maintain the moon in its present location. We tried to mitigate the problem by exaggerating the rise and fall and the extreme northern and southern latitudes and minimizing it around the equator where the water is warmer and more hospitable. But what about the cost of building floating docks in places like Maine? Someone shouted from the back of the room. And the smell every 8 hours when all that mud and guck is exposed. God winced. He was hoping that this point would not come up because it might generate air quality review. Another year of monitoring and more millions for consultants. Yes, somebody else said, what about erosion? Who's going to pay to shore up the foundation on my cottage? Some erosion at the edge of any water body is inevitable, God pointed out, trying to stay calm. But his answer was lost in the chorus of other questions from the audience. Had he done a study of the effects on aquatic organisms? What about the wetlands? How would people figure out who owned the intertidal zone? Where was his noise study? Those waves coming in all night would make it impossible to sleep. What about possible saltwater effects on adjacent wells or impacts on seabird nesting patterns? Quietly, God folded his files and started to leave. Looking back at the board, he saw that they were arguing about whether the public hearing schedule should be extended to include a few days in the southern hemisphere, and whether a solid waste review was necessary because of the driftwood problem. On his way out, God bent down and whispered something to his administrative assistant. Noah, he said, I think I have another idea. So, that's from a little-known book called the Casco Bay Scrolls. But I wrote those words in 1992, and at that time I had not yet served in public office, but I've had a variety of backgrounds that are relevant somewhat to the discussion of this question. I've been an environmental attorney. I was the lobbyist for all the environmental groups in Maine in the 1970s, helped draft our bottle bill, helped draft our billboard bill that took billboards off our highways. I can say that with some pride because the draftsmanship consisted of joining a young attorney general, and he and I took the Vermont billboard bill, and everywhere it said Vermont, we crossed it out and wrote Maine. That was the drafting. I then went to work in the alternative energy field, hydro, biomass, then did work in conservation, started my own business, did 48 major energy conservation projects around Maine, each one of which, by the way, required local permits from the building permit, electrical permits. Then served as governor for 8 years, then did some work in the wind Bangor Savings Bank or Androscoggin Savings Bank or any of the other small community banks in Maine did not cause the crash in 2008. And yet they're getting a lot of the burden from the Dodd-Frank bill. Every time I see Maine bankers, that's all they want to talk about is the mountain of new applications. I think it's now up to 39 forms that a borrower has to sign in order to get a simple home mortgage. And the burden is high, the cost is high. Small banks are now hiring compliance officers and laying off loan officers because they have to do all this work on the regulatory compliance that isn't necessarily contributing to the solution of any discernible problem. You've seen these studies, I'm sure. There are a bunch of them out there where people have calculated the cost of a regulation per life saved, health and safety regulations. Unvented